They introduced ladybugs to Italy, but they turned out to be aggressive predators. Their ability to kill doesn't develop over time, it's innate. The moment they hatch, the larvae are already actively hunting and feeding on prey. Adults do the same. They don't need to learn from others. Their jaws, digestive system, and behavior are built from the start to find, seize, and consume their victims. But why bring them in? In Italy, one of the most widespread agricultural pests is aphids. In greenhouses and plant nurseries, they can wipe out crops fast. Leaves get chewed up, new shoots become twisted and deformed, and a sticky film appears on the plants. In the end, whole fields suffer. Plants lose their marketable look and can't really be sold. And these tiny insects living in colonies and sucking the sap from plants are exactly what ladybugs have learned to hunt and kill. Aphids hardly move, and they rarely manage to fly away in time. They sit packed together on tender new growth like food rolling down a conveyor belt. For a ladybug, it's perfect. Find one colony and you've got dozens or even hundreds of easy targets right nearby, ready to be picked off quickly with no chase at all. And since aphids reproduce so quickly, the food supply doesn't vanish overnight. The colony keeps refilling with new individuals. That's why aphids become their main prey. And here's where the real problem begins. Aphids aren't dangerous because they're strong, but because they reproduce at an absolutely insane rate. During the warm season, females of many aphid species can produce offspring without mating. It's called parthenogenesis, and it acts like a turbo boost. On top of that, they often give birth to live nymphs instead of laying eggs, so there's almost no downtime. Each new female starts reproducing soon after. The colony can explode fast. Yesterday, there were just a couple of aphids on a plant, and a week later, it's crawling with them. At that point, the plant gets drained of its sap, growth slows, leaves curl up, and in agriculture, that means real damage and real losses. Plants weaken, yields drop, money bleeds out, so you can't afford to wait. A fair question, since ladybugs are already out there. Why don't farmers in Italy just wait for them to show up on their own? Because aphids get a head start. While predators are still somewhere nearby, the colony on a specific patch has time to ramp up and spread onto fresh shoots. Ladybugs aren't guaranteed to appear in a field at the exact place and moment you need them. They first have to detect the hotspot, fly over, and actually settle in. Let's wait until it's too late, then we'll fly in. Come on, get to work. Mamma mia. The release is done so you don't have to wait for ladybugs to find the hotspot on their own. Instead, they're brought in ahead of time and released right where the aphids already are before the pests have had a chance to spread through the planting. That timing matters in agriculture. The damage doesn't rise gradually, it spikes once the colony crosses a critical population threshold. It feels like the easiest thing is to just torch aphids with chemicals. One spray and the whole colony disappears. Quick and brutal. That's how people have done it for decades because it seems like the fastest, most reliable fix. But aphids have an answer. They reproduce in huge numbers, and among millions of them, there are almost always a few that, purely by chance, handle the spray better than the rest. After treatment, those are the ones that survive, and then it's their offspring that multiply. Phew, looks like that was the last one. Oh, fuck. Use the same poison again and it's no longer that efficient because the population shifts toward more resistant lines, so chemicals often turns into a race. New products, higher doses, tighter schedules. On large plantings and in greenhouses, you can see it clearly. The aphids come back faster than you can keep up. What do you do when the pesticide no longer wipes out aphids on the first go? You end up looking for answers not in chemical stockpiles, but in the ecosystem itself. That's where biological control comes in. Instead of trying to kill every last pest, you introduce their natural enemies and rely on predator pressure to keep populations down. In agriculture, this has long been standard practice. Not theory, there are commercial suppliers that breed beneficial insect allies and sell them for release in orchards, greenhouses, and crop fields. It's about staying in control. Fewer spray rounds, fewer repeat outbreaks, and less dependence on a single active ingredient. People are buying time and a real chance to stop aphids from exploding to the point where they start damaging the harvest. Why do ladybugs end up in this role so often? Because to keep aphids in check, you don't need a terrifying predator. You need something that can physically eat a lot of tiny prey every single day. Basically, someone with a serious appetite, like a vacuum cleaner for aphids, an aphid vac. Ladybugs have everything you want for that job. They're active hunters right on the plants. They track down colonies on leaves and new shoots, and they can quickly drive aphid numbers down in places where the insects form a dense layer. In agronomy, people value them for one simple thing: speed. When a hotspot appears in a planting, the predator can't just be present, it has to knock the numbers down hard. Otherwise, the colony rebounds and starts growing again. That's why ladybugs are treated as a real working tool. They give a measurable result if they arrive in the right place at the right time. There's an important catch here. Releasing ladybugs doesn't mean grabbing whatever ones you happen to find. In biological control, people often choose a specific species to match the pest, the crop, and the local conditions, because different insects behave differently in terms of how well they stay on plants, how fast they reproduce, and how effectively they suppress aphids. In Europe, including Italy, both native and introduced aphid predators have been tested over the years. For example, Hippodamia convergens, a North American species, was recently released in Europe, including in France and Italy. And for protected cultivation and for urban trees in Europe, the choice falls on Adalia bipunctata. And why? Meanwhile, Coccinella septempunctata is a powerful aphid predator, and it has indeed been used in biocontrol programs. But practical releases aren't about the species we like. The choice must actually work in a specific system. It depends on how easy it is to mass produce enough individuals, how well they remain on plants, how quickly they disperse, and how predictable the results are. Reviews on releasing natural enemies point out this exact thing. The choice often comes down to how practical the species is to rear and deploy, not who looks the strongest on paper. So the common ladybug isn't bad, it's just not always the most convenient option. One more thing people often miss: a ladybug isn't just the round, shiny, and spotted adult. When it comes to fighting aphids, the most important stage is the larva. The larvae look like tiny alligators crawling on the leaves, and they spend almost all their time eating. They have to grow, and they turn aphids into fuel for development. That's why in biological control, larvae are often considered especially valuable. They're already on site, they're not wasting time looking for a mate, and their behavior is as straightforward as it gets. They crawl and eat. What? I need to grow? Research on the feeding and development of predatory ladybugs shows a basic pattern. Larvae are active insect eaters and consume large amounts of prey because growth requires a steady supply of food. But here's what doesn't add up. The idea that you release them and the problem solved sounds way too simple because nature doesn't work like that. If it were that easy, aphids would have disappeared as a species a long time ago. And yet, here they are. In practice, the outcome depends on details people don't usually see. How early the outbreak was spotted, how many aphids you actually had at the start, whether other natural enemies are nearby, and most importantly, who's getting in the predator's way. Ants, for example, often herd aphids for their sugary secretions and can chase off or attack ladybugs and their larvae, protecting the colony. And you've got weather, crop structure, pesticide carryover, and even the exact release window. In short, a million ways to mess it up and end up with a pretty mediocre result. That's why they sometimes make a choice that might seem odd. Why release larvae instead of adults? Because adults mean mobility, and mobility isn't always a good thing. A fully grown ladybug can fly, so there isn't much aphid nearby. If it's hot, windy, or there's simply a more delicious hotspot close by, some of them may just take off, and then you lose control of the exact spot you were trying to protect in the first place. A larva won't do that. It can't fly, and a random gust of wind won't accidentally carry it into the neighboring garden. It stays on the plant and starts eating exactly where you put it. That's why in practical biocontrol, releasing larvae is used as a way to apply immediate pressure on an aphid colony right where you need it. It simply provides better control. And that raises a question: how does a ladybug even find aphids when the field is huge and the colony is just a tiny patch on a single plant? If it relied on chance, it would be like playing the lottery. Ladybugs have a targeting system. They follow chemical clues. A plant being drained by aphids changes its smell. It releases airborne compounds, and that works like an alarm saying food is somewhere nearby, so there's no need to waste time. On top of that, aphids leave traces of their own. Sticky, sweet droplets, the scent of the colony, and, when threatened, an alarm signal that also changes how everything smells around the plant. So the ladybug isn't guessing, it's pinpointing the scene of an ongoing attack and flying straight to where the prey actually is. Yes, that's the whole point. The plant doesn't just sit there quietly while aphids suck its sap. When it gets damaged, it switches on the chemical defenses and at the same time starts releasing airborne compounds that can attract the pest's natural enemies. It almost looks like a distress call. For the plant, it's beneficial if a predator shows up nearby because the plant itself can't exactly eat the aphids. Hey, shoo, get lost! Come on, move it! Get out of here! Ugh. In biology, this is called tritrophic interactions. The plant is harmed by the pest and uses signals to attract the pest's enemies, predators, or parasitoids. So a ladybug often isn't flying to some random aphid, but to a plant that's already given itself away with the smell of trouble. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A ladybug is a predator, and predators don't really understand who they're allowed to eat and who they aren't. Ladybugs can engage in intra-guild predation. They may eat other beneficial predators that also hunt aphids, basically wrecking someone else's work. And there's cannibalism too, eating the eggs and larvae of their own species, especially when food is scarce or when the leaf is crowded. It's simply a survival tactic, a way to get protein fast. Not a single aphid is getting away. Hey, what are you doing? Hey, this is actually fun. For biological control, that matters a lot. You release a helper, and it may start cutting down not only the aphids, but also your allies, or even its own future population. That's why the outcome can look weird sometimes. The ladybugs are there, but stable control isn't because they're competing and eating each other too. Biocontrol is often sold as an eco-miracle, but it doesn't have to work perfectly. You release a predator and it doesn't end up in a lab tank, it ends up in a real ecosystem where it has its own priorities. Survive, reproduce, take a niche. If things go too well for that species, mild climate, plenty of food, very few natural checks, it can establish itself and start spreading. And then your helpful ally becomes a new source of pressure on local insects, including other ladybugs. That's exactly why biocontrol is always a risk. It might solve one problem for you today and create a different one tomorrow. Simply because you introduced a strong player into the system, one that has no idea it's been hired to do a job. To understand why the whole idea of releases became popular in the first place, there's one early precedent that blew everyone away. In late 19th century California, citrus groves were being strangled by a pest, the cottony cushion scale. Chemicals weren't doing much back then, and the damage kept mounting. The solution turned out to be unexpected. People brought in a predatory ladybug from Australia, and it really did start clearing the pest off the trees so efficiently that it became one of the first widely celebrated successes of classical biological control. And that's what's gonna happen to every one of you bitches. That story's what proved a simple predator versus pest approach could save an entire industry. After a case like that, the idea caught on. If one well-chosen predator can keep a pest in check better than endless spray treatments, then you can do it again and again. And that's exactly what people started doing. First as scientific experiments and then as everyday practice. Biological control began to take shape as its own field, finding natural enemies, breeding them, testing them, and releasing them. Europe got involved quickly because agriculture here is intensive and pests can multiply fast almost anywhere. In Italy, as in other countries, the method was tested and introduced wherever a quick effect was needed without getting trapped in a constant chemical arms race. Over time, releasing helpful predators became a standard tool in agronomy. Why Italy specifically and not the other countries? Because for aphids, the Mediterranean's basically a resort. Well, not just for aphids, but that's not the point right now. In many areas, winters are milder, plants stay green longer, and in greenhouses, production runs almost year-round, so the pest has fewer months when it's barely active. On top of that, Italy has a lot of intensive crops where tender young shoots appear in waves, vegetables, orchard and ornamental plants, citrus, vineyards. For aphids, that means a constant supply of fresh feeding spots, so outbreaks can start early and repeat several times in a single season. That's why agronomists need a fast tool here. And it's not only aphids that thrive, whiteflies, thrips, mites. So biological control is part of an integrated protection strategy here, along with monitoring. All right, back to the point. Let's break down how a ladybug actually kills its prey. Its hunting style? Simple and fast. And what does that mean in practice? A repeating mechanics. It crawls along a leaf, grabs an aphid with its jaws, pins it down, punctures the soft body, and literally chews it up, then does it again and again. But this behavior isn't identical in every situation. When aphids are scarce, the ladybug spends more time searching. When aphids are abundant, more time goes into handling prey because every single aphid still has to be caught and eaten. That's why there's a predictable relationship between aphid density and the ladybug's kill rate. And here's why the weather can suddenly decide half the outcome. A ladybug is a cold-blooded insect. The speed of its movements, its reflexes, even how its muscles work all depend directly on temperature. When it's cool, it crawls slower, takes off less often, and thinks longer on a leaf, giving the aphid colony extra hours and days to grow. Okay, I'm coming in from the right. You come in from the left. I got a different idea. What if we just... Steve! Zoned out. What are we talking about? It's been 2 months! When it's warmer, the ladybug actively searches for hotspots, runs into prey more often, and generally manages to eat more in the same amount of time. But there are limits. If it gets too hot, activity can drop too. Overheating and dehydration kick in. So what were you trying to say? Oh, so what if we just... Again? That's why releasing the same batch on different days can give different results. Not because the ladybugs are lazy, but because their body mechanics change along with the air. And here's the key takeaway. Ladybugs aren't good guy cleanup crews. They're adaptive predators. In other words, they're not trying to save your crop. They just want to eat. When aphids disappear, many ladybug species don't just drop dead on the spot, they switch gears, feeding on other small, soft-bodied insects as well as eggs and larvae, and sometimes even grabbing pollen and nectar as a quick snack until food is plentiful again. That flexibility is a big reason they're so successful. It lets them stick around in environments where prey pops up in clusters and vanishes just as fast, but there's a downside. A highly flexible predator can establish itself more easily in new regions and put heavier pressure on native insects, so being a generalist is both an advantage for biocontrol and one of the reasons it can spark future conflicts in an ecosystem. That raises a fair question. If ladybugs help, why not just rely on the wild populations? In practice, natural predator populations often don't line up with an aphid outbreak. Aphids show up early and multiply fast, while ladybugs may still be elsewhere in a different stage of their life cycle or simply too scarce in that particular planting. A commercial release is a way to artificially boost predator density exactly where it's needed, like calling in backup. That's why there's a whole market around biocontrol. Companies rear beneficial insects, package larvae or adults, and sell them for specific crops and conditions. Agronomists need predictable pressure on aphids, not a hope and pray strategy. But there's one crucial detail. Ladybugs have a life cycle, and the outcome depends on how that cycle lines up with the aphids. If you release them at the wrong time, the population won't establish itself even if they hunt well. In aphid-eating species like Adalia bipunctata, development goes through complete metamorphosis: egg, larva, pupa, adult beetle. While the larva is growing, it needs prey continuously. If the aphids have already been blown off the plants or there aren't enough of them, some larvae won't survive, and others emerge weak. On the other hand, if the aphids have already spread across the field, the young stages may simply be too late to contain the hotspots. That's why timing matters so much in biocontrol. The release has to land in a window when food is available. After all that, you might say, if it's this hard, let's just forget about ladybugs altogether. But opting out comes with a price. When you rely only on chemical control, the whole system gets fragile. You have to spray more often, keep switching active ingredients, track residues and pre-harvest intervals, and aphids can still come back in waves. And there's collateral damage. Insecticides don't just hit aphids, they also take out the beneficial insects that could keep pests in check. Predators, parasitoids, and pollinators. That can trigger secondary outbreaks where some other pest survives the treatment and suddenly fills the empty niche. So people use biocontrol not because it's perfect, but because the alternative often turns into an endless arm race with side effects. In short, it's going to be complicated either way. But there's one thing people usually overlook. You can't wipe out aphids forever. In an ecosystem, there's almost never empty space. Remove one player and you free up resources that someone else will immediately take. If you wipe out the aphids with chemicals and knock out their natural enemies at the same time, the next outbreak might be whiteflies, thrips, mites, any pest that can reproduce fast when nothing is holding it back. That's why modern plant protection keeps coming back to balance and action thresholds. The goal is to keep pest numbers below the point where they cause economic damage, not to chase a 100% kill rate. Ladybugs and other predators in this logic are part of the pressure that stops a pest from exploding out of control. It's more resilient that way. The system stays alive, and it has a built-in safety net against new outbreaks. And if you're wondering how ladybugs learned to kill, well, they didn't. They're predators by nature. It's just that people learned how to use them as a tool against aphids. A ladybug does what it was made to do: eat, survive, reproduce. A human decides where and how many of these predators will show up and sets off a chain of consequences. The harshest example is the Asian lady beetle, Harmonia axyridis. It was widely used as a biocontrol agent against aphids, and then it established itself in the wild, turned invasive, and started wiping out native species. It competes for food, eats eggs and larvae, and throws the balance off. Release it without strict control, and today's hero can turn into tomorrow's pest. You owe me a like. See you later.